Part 4. Mises in his prime. Chapter 12. Fresh Start. Austria's situation considerably worsened under the impact of the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, signed on September 10, 1919. The treaty was a diktat rather than a true agreement, designed to ensure the political weakness of Germans rather than durable peace among the nations. During the 1920s and 30s, many testimonies and analyses appeared in France, Britain, and the United States that condemned the treaty as a prolongation of the hostilities by other means, and thus as a heavy burden on future peace in Europe. It placed all burdens attributable to the Austrian part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy on German Austria, and in all questions pertaining to the relations between the successor states of the monarchy, it ruled against German Austria and in favor of the other states. This procedure was based on the view that the Habsburg family had pursued a long-standing policy of German hegemony vis-à-vis the Czech, Slovenian, Italian, Croatian, and Polish peoples, and that therefore the German Austrians now had to bear all costs related to the military defeat and to the dissolution of the empire. In accordance with this view, the treaty stipulated that the Republic of Deutsch Österreich, German Austria, changed its name into Republik Österreich, an unusual provision, to say the least, but the new Republic of Austria had also to endure humiliating demands of a less cosmetic nature. While the principle of national self-determination had been used to justify the separation of Czech, Polish, and Yugoslav lands from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the goal of making the Germans pay trumped principle. In the Czech case, historical law was invoked to justify the incorporation of the Sudetenland, which had first been settled by Germans and still had a vast German majority. And in the case of Italy, the establishment of a natural border at the Brenner Pass brought South Tyrol under Italian dominion. In German Austria's own case, independence was considered more important than the desire of its inhabitants to join the German Reich. 3 months after the Treaty of Saint-Germain had been signed, all the Austrian provincial parliaments voted resolutions in favor of the establishment of economic union with the German Reich. The Entente reacted immediately on December 17, 1919, insisting that Austria's political and economic independence not be relinquished. German Austria lost almost 40,000 square miles, more than a third of its soil, territories that for centuries had been inhabited and cultivated by Germans. Most of the other stipulations of the treaty further humiliated German Austria and poisoned relations with its neighbors. The most pressing problems were of a financial nature. The Allies were holding German Austria alone responsible for the debts of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because war bonds and other war-related debts were denominated in kronen, they could be handled through the printing of more banknotes. But 2 other financial liabilities proved permanent and pernicious: the salaries of the civil servants and the massive deficits being run up by government-owned industry. Civil servants in Austria-Hungary had been predominantly German, and a great number of them lived in Vienna. After the dissolution of the empire, German Austrians found themselves in the awkward position of having 5 million citizens supporting a civil service developed for 50 million. Various means would try to reduce the number of civil servants, but in 1922, 1 out of 10 men still received a salary from the public treasury. While the excessive number of civil servants was an inheritance from the old empire, public firms running huge losses were the achievement of the Social Democrats, who had socialized the coal mines and other industries. Under these circumstances, it was out of the question for German Austria to pay damages to anyone. Its citizens were hardly able to feed themselves, especially in Vienna. The traditional trade channels with the eastern provinces no longer existed. Trade with its Czech, Yugoslav, Hungarian, and Polish neighbors, who were even more nationalist and protectionist than the Austrians themselves, had fallen to a minimum. Far from being able to pay reparations, German Austria depended for survival on the financial support of its former enemies, and from the end of 1919 onwards, it did receive such help. Hayek and the Bureau for Claims Settlements. According to Article 248 of the treaty, the new Austria had to pay damages to foreign governments and their citizens. These foreign beneficiaries were not limited to the Entente powers, but included the non-German territories of the Old Austria, which, according to the stipulations of the treaty, were counted as states associated with the Entente. Article 248 had largely been copied from an analogous provision of the Treaty of Versailles, which concerned the much less complicated case of Germany. It was completely unclear how it should be put into practice in the Austrian case. Once again, it was the public administration experts from the Vienna Kammer who had to find a way out. During the war, Mises's friend, Emil Peros, had founded an office for the protection of Austrian assets abroad, Schutzstelle für österreichisches Vermögen im Auslande, the purpose of which was to protect the private claims of the citizens of Austria-Hungary and to establish records of existing claims of these citizens on those of enemy countries. After the ratification of the Treaty of Saint-Germain in the fall of 1920, the Austrian government transformed this organization into the Abrechnungsamt, a governmental bureau for claim settlements. Peres remained the chief executive, and several other men were also appointed to its board, Mises among them. The two Kammer secretaries shared a predilection for efficient organization and kept the new bureau for claim settlements as small as possible. While its German equivalent in Berlin had more than 1,000 employees by 1922, the Vienna organization, which had to deal with far more complicated cases, had a headcount of 150. In June of 1922, Peres left the bureau for a more prestigious appointment, and Mises succeeded him. 2.5 years later, Mises quit the position too, ostensibly because his new position as vice-director of the Kammer and his research agenda did not leave him enough time to shoulder the responsibilities of the office. His former employees praised him for using his contacts in industrial and banking circles for the successful floating of a bureau bond, Abrechnungsschuldverschreibung, to finance the payments resulting from the settlement process. But the newspapers reported on conflicts between Mises and the finance ministry concerning payments of pre-war debts, which the ministry had delayed. In short, the problem was that Mises had persuaded certain people to finance his government, and now the government refused to pay them back. Mises wanted no part of such an organization. For Mises himself, the time he spent at the Bureau for Claim Settlements was especially memorable, because it brought him in touch with the young student who would eventually become his most important intellectual ally and a friend for many years. By December 1921, Friedrich August von Hayek, 1899-1992, had received his first doctorate in law when he applied for a position at the Bureau. Mises himself conducted the interview. Hayek presented a letter of recommendation from Friedrich von Mises, who praised him as a promising young economist. Mises smiled and said he had never seen Hayek in his lectures, but given Mises' letter it would be rude to reject the young man, so he hired him on the spot. Mises assigned him to research money and banking theory. Hayek quickly showed himself a useful assistant, alerting Mises to the case for free banking. More than any of his fellow students, Hayek was an adventurer. His peers, Haberler and Voegelin, were anxious not to leave the well-trodden career out. They eventually left Vienna to study in the United States when prestigious Rockefeller stipends became available for Austrian students in 1924. The Laura Spelman Rockefeller Fund had followed a 1922 suggestion by Beardsley Rummel to move into the field of the social sciences. In 1923, the fund started investing in social research with an explicit long-term scientific orientation. In the same year, the Social Science Research Council was established, also on the initiative of Rummel. But Hayek was curious enough to travel to New York on his own, with no money and only his capacity and readiness for intellectual hard work. Mises encouraged and supported the project. Upon receiving his second doctorate in economics, Hayek left for New York City in March of 1923 and stayed until May 1924. On the boat to New York, he started translating Pearson's article on the value problem in socialist societies. The translation was probably ready in August, and Hayek submitted it to Weiss, who at the time was the editor of the Zeitschrift. He found employment as a translator for economics Professor Jeremiah W. Jenks, whom he had met in Vienna in the spring of 1922. Later, he also worked for Professor Wesley Mitchell at the National Bureau for Economic Research, collecting data for his book on business cycles. Mitchell was a great admirer of Mises, and Hayek provided him with background information that Mitchell used in his preface for the American edition of Mises' textbook. Hayek also talked to him about Mises. To Mitchell's mild astonishment, Hayek put Mises in the same class as Voltaire, Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and John Stuart Mill. When Hayek returned to Vienna, he was thoroughly acquainted with American methods of business cycle research, knowledge that would prove to be highly useful 2 years later, when Mises established an Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research, mainly to provide Hayek with a suitable position. Hayek's teacher Wiese had been the main contact of the Rockefeller Foundation among the academic economists in Vienna. He made sure that Hayek was granted the first Rockefeller Fellowship while he was still in Manhattan. But the notification reached the young man only after he had already returned to Vienna. By then he was unwilling to accept the fellowship. Mises then tried to hire Hayek for the Kammer Library, but it was Haberler who eventually obtained the position. These early problems foreshadowed Hayek's lifetime lack of talent as a careerist. Fighting inflation. There was a reason Mises encouraged Hayek and all students he mentored to study the problems of currency and banking. Austrian public finance was in terrible shape, and the government paid for substantial parts of its expenditures by printing more money. Wartime controls on foreign exchange were still in place to encourage the belief among the citizens that the government was fighting rather than creating inflation. Mises successfully mobilized the Kammer apparatus to oppose foreign exchange controls. In the Kammer General Assembly, he quoted from letters in which affiliated entrepreneurs described how the current monetary regime made it virtually impossible for them to serve geographically close customers who used a very different currency. Mises also had a more direct impact on monetary policy. Owing to his position in the Bureau for Claims Settlements and in the first Renner government, he was one of a handful of senior advisers to the Austro-Hungarian Bank, the central bank of the old monarchy, which survived several years into the Republic. The governor of the bank, Alexander Spitzmüller, was determined not only to stop the fall of the krone, but to increase its exchange rate in a manner similar to what Churchill was about to do in Britain. See, for example, the documents concerning a May 24, 1921 meeting on the premises of the bank to discuss exchange rate policies. Among the participants were Spitzmüller, Wiese, Schumpeter, Schwedland, Schiff, and Mises. Mises certainly opposed Spitzmüller's plan and disagreed with his view that a stabilization of the krone at its present low value would amount to a bankruptcy of the state. Mises's position can be inferred from his writings, including the following passage in a 1923 essay. It is quite wrong to consider devaluation to be a case of state bankruptcy. Stabilization of the present low value of money, even if considered only with respect to its effect on existing debts, is something very different. It is both more and less than state bankruptcy. It is more than state bankruptcy to the extent that it affects not only public debts, but also all private debts. It is less than state bankruptcy on the one hand to the extent that it also affects the government's assets denominated in paper money. On the other hand, to the extent that it does not affect its obligations denominated in hard money or foreign currency. The general economic effects, and in particular the trade political effects of any money-induced change of the purchasing power of money, hence also the effects of a rising purchasing power of money, weigh in against any attempt to raise the value of money before stabilizing it. The present level of the value of money should be stabilized. Mises pointed out that it was not possible to compensate the owners of claims denominated in marks for losses they have suffered from 1914 to 1923, because the present owners of the claims are not always identical with those who have suffered the loss. The bulk of the fungible claims and a considerable part of all other claims have changed hands over the years. His argument ultimately won the day and provided the basis for the currency reforms of the fall of 1922, but only after fierce resistance from Spitzmüller who remained unconvinced and clashed with Mises repeatedly. Or in more diplomatic terms, Spitzmüller had taken measures that in my eyes were inadequate. I have publicly spoken against these measures, for example against foreign exchange controls, and I have frequently explained my standpoint in discussions with Excellency Spitzmüller. I have not succeeded in convincing him of the pertinence of my views. Spitzmüller remained faithful to his line, even many years after the event. In March of 1929 he gave 2 lectures on the policy of the Austrian Central Bank. He attacked the stance taken by the bank and by the industry, and in his second lecture also dealt several times with Mises, whom he criticized for an alleged lack of consistency. Spitzmüller later honored Mises as the most important Austrian monetary politician. Mises reacted to a statement to this effect of Spitzmüller's in a comment made at the 1924 meeting of the Verein für Sozialpolitik. However, Mises always stressed that his influence was entirely through writing and public lectures. The monetary stabilization of 1922 was the only time official policy met with his approval. On October 21st, 1921, Mises lectured before the Österreichische Politische Gesellschaft, Austrian Political Society, on the present state of Austria's public finance. He argued that the government budget could only be balanced by eliminating food subsidies and selling public enterprises. Every other proposal fundamentally failed to come to grips with the question of how to balance the budget. The Schober government still preferred the printing press. The ever-increasing production of Corona notes was soon followed by a decrease in real purchasing power. The more banknotes the Austro-Hungarian bank issued, the weaker they became. This development became a serious threat to the Austrian economy in the late fall of 1921, increasingly thwarting the financial plans of Austrian firms and choking the division of labor. In Germany, where the same phenomenon could be observed, the most eminent monetary expert, Reichsbank President Rudolf Havenstein and Finance Minister Karl Helfferich, believed there was no causal connection between these events. The decline of the purchasing power of the mark resulted, among other things, from the deficit of Germany's balance of payments, and the Reichsbank's increase of the nominal mark supply was necessary to prevent a further decline of the mark supply in real terms. These views impressed the Austrian public and influential circles within government, but Mises was unconvinced. The purchasing power of money declined faster than the new banknotes were printed, but that was because of the present expectations of money holders concerning the future purchasing power of their money. If the future prospects for a money are considered poor, its value in speculation, which anticipates its future purchasing power, will be lower than the actual demand and supply situation at the moment would indicate. Prices will be asked and paid which more nearly correspond to anticipated future conditions than to the present demand for and quantity of money in circulation. The monetary units available at the moment are not sufficient to pay the prices which correspond to the anticipated future demands for and quantity of monetary units. So trade suffers from a shortage of notes. There are not enough monetary units on hand to complete the business transactions agreed upon. This phenomenon could be clearly seen in Austria in the late fall of 1921. Thus, there was in fact a causal relationship between the increased production of money and the overproportional decline of the purchasing power of money. The decline of Austria's money could not be stopped or even reversed through the printing press. On the contrary, more inflation would aggravate the situation even further. The problem was that Spitzmüller's Austro-Hungarian bank was still a stronghold of the party of inflation. This concerned in particular the Austrian directors, who were predominantly statist and inflationist. The Hungarian directors were generally advocates of the gold standard. Mises made this point in a 1924 Verein für Sozialpolitik debate with Spitzmüller. The bank followed the Helfferich-Havenstein line in a desperate attempt to catch up with the shrinking krone by printing yet more of them. Mises tried to steer counter as much as possible, placing 2 articles in the Neue Freie Presse in March 1922, Inflation and the Shortage of Money, against the continued use of the printing press, and The Austrian Monetary Problem 30 years ago and Today, a commentary. The editor of the Neue Freie Presse, Moritz Dulp, thanked Mises especially for the latter piece in which he had quoted from a speech by Karl Menger, who was himself a former editor of the NFP. He especially sought to raise the public's awareness of the destruction that the inflation wrought on the economy. Austria had become a poor country and already had to pay for at least a part of its imports by decreasing its capital base, but inflation would destroy it altogether. As he explained to Moritz Dulp, I think that in evaluating our situation one has to strictly distinguish between 2 things. There is on the one hand the inflation, which leads to increasing prices for all commodities and for foreign currency. On the other hand, there is the fact that our population lives today from capital consumption and pays for imported commodities through the export of capital assets, such as fungible claims and other ownership titles. Between these 2 facts, there is, however, something of a close connection to the extent that the falsification that the inflation has induced in the calculation of business profits represents the psychological basis for the unrestrained consumption of the accumulated capital of the national economy. The devaluation of money leads to illusory profits that the people have long held to be true profits. Moritz Dulp was the economics editor of the Neue Freie Presse and author of several popular books on economic problems. In the post-war period he published 2 works on the catastrophic boom induced by inflation of the money supply. Seminars. If Mises was waging a campaign against the dangers of economic ignorance, the classroom remained campaign headquarters. The winter semester of 1920 to 1921 concentrated on business cycle theory, featuring sessions on the problem of economic crises, on what are normal or good or bad economic conditions, on the historical crises of 1900 to 1902, 1907, 1873, and on the permanent effects of the business cycle. In the winter semester of 1921 to 1922, his university seminar focused on some larger issues of monetary theory. It was a memorable semester because for the first time the participants included several who would become his star students, Hayek, Haberler, Machlup, and Schütz. While the pedagogical effort made in the seminars on theoretical economics was related to the pressing issues of Austria's monetary policy, the subjects discussed in Mises's private seminar were less directly connected to current political events. In the next few years, the private seminar continued the discussion of basic conceptual problems of economics, but increasingly turned to the discussion of fundamentally different approaches in the social sciences. Hayek sometimes found these debates grueling and felt relieved when he left Vienna to spend a year in New York. On the whole, I felt somewhat tired of the subjects which had chiefly occupied me in Vienna during the preceding year or so, such as the theory of subjective value or the problem of economic calculation under socialism, and comparing the way things were discussed in the United States with what he knew from home, he praised the greater focus of the American way. Insofar as theoretical discussions take place here at all, they have one great advantage. There is a certain stock of generally recognized doctrine which corresponds essentially to that of the Marxian school, and which is unquestionably accepted, to the point that when a problem is discussed, the discussion concerns only this problem, and not the entire foundations of economics. By the time Hayek returned to Vienna in May 1924, the seminar had an eminently interdisciplinary character. Fewer than a third of the members, Striegel, Haberler, Hayek, Machlup, Morgenstern, Lise, and Braun, were trained economists. Thus, the discussions must have been more philosophical than typical present-day debates. The meetings took place on Friday nights on a fortnightly basis. The 20-some participants assembled in Mises's office at the Kammer around 7 p.m. One member gave a short introductory talk, which was followed by a long discussion until 10:30, at which point the official part of the evening ended and the assembly moved to a restaurant, usually an Italian restaurant called Ancora Verde, where the unofficial debate continued. The most ardent debaters, Mises usually among them, finally went on to the Café Künstler and stayed until 2 or 3 a.m. Mises later insisted that in this circle he was not a teacher and director, but only the first among equals. All who belonged to the circle came voluntarily, only imbued by the drive to gain more knowledge. They came as disciples, but in the course of the years they turned into friends. Later, some people of my own age joined the circle too. Scholars from abroad who paid a visit to Vienna were welcome guests and took part in the meetings. The private seminar was, and always remained, the circle of my much younger friends. Outsiders knew nothing of our meetings. They only saw the works published by individual members. We formed no school, no community, and no sect. We supported one another more through dissent than through assent. We were agreed and united only in one thing, in striving to build up the sciences of human action. Each one went the way that his own law pointed out to him. We have never organized or undertaken anything else that would have resembled the abject doing research of the scientists of imperial and post-imperial Germany. We have never pondered the thought of publishing a journal or a collective volume. Each one has worked by himself as it befits the thinker, but each single one of us has contributed to the circle and looked for no other compensation than the recognition, not the applause, of his friends. There was greatness in this unpretentious exchange of ideas. We all found happiness and satisfaction in it. Mises' long shadow. The seminars Mises held in Vienna in the 1920s, especially the private seminar that he held in his Kammer office, have become legendary due to the prominent role that some of its members played in the social sciences after the Second World War. The sessions were formative for these young men, even though Mises' personal impact was not as considerable as one might expect, especially in the case of Hayek, Haberler, Strigel, and Machlup, who worked with him, albeit with interruptions, for more than 10 years. For these men, Mises was more role model than teacher. In the discussions of the private seminar, he displayed his ability to dissect all kinds of problems in social analysis, just as he had learned from bohm-bawerk. Yet he did not raise a school of disciples advocating his doctrines. It is, of course, the hope of every scholar that others will find his approach interesting and important enough to continue the work where he has left off. But Mises made no efforts to stimulate discipleship, and in fact had no disciples during his Vienna years. To no small extent this was due to the ideal of individualism. Steeped in the idealism of Schiller, Herder, W.V. Humboldt, and other classical German authors, Mises considered the free development of the individual to be the supreme goal of human achievement. It was more important than any particular creed in religion, politics, or aesthetics. He certainly did not lack firm convictions in politics and science, but in his interactions with students and other people, these convictions took only second place to the reverence he paid to the ideal of individualism. After 1926, when he succeeded Wiese as the main contact of the Rockefeller Foundation in Vienna, Mises had the opportunity to provide or withhold material benefits, but he did not use this power to raise epigons. Noble as this attitude was, it gave a competitive edge to some of his rivals who did not have the same scruples. But the most important factor responsible for the virtual absence of a school of Misesians in the 1920s was that Mises' professional standing was not paramount. When Hayek, Haberler, Machlup, and Schütz first took part in one of his seminars, Mises was a respected expert on monetary economics and the author of a controversial book on contemporary political problems, Socialism. Although he was one of the best-known theorists in the German-speaking world, to his students he lacked the fame and brilliance of three other professors of the Department of Law and Government Science, Hans Kelsen, Karl Grünberg, and Ottmar Spann. Kelsen was the celebrated creator of the Austrian Republican Constitution and pioneer of the pure theory of law. Grünberg a chief Vienna intellectual of the social democratic movement, and Spann the author of the most successful social science textbook ever published in the German language. In 1919, Spann had obtained Filipovich's position, which had been vacant for 2 years. Among the professors of economics, he attracted by far the greatest number of students. His theory of universalism was a sophisticated development of the older organic theories of society, which were widespread and deep-rooted in Catholic countries such as Austria. In the crisis-torn years after the war, universalism was not only more accessible for most people, it also accommodated a deep longing for security and authority. Whereas Wiese and Mises dealt with relatively narrow economic subjects and the technicalities of the Austrian school's marginal value analysis, Spann confronted the students with a broad picture of social life. His lectures and seminars attracted students whose emotional life was steeped in Catholicism, Romanticism, idealism, and nationalism. Spann's best-known student was the later Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, but he also impressed young scholars of the Austrian school such as Hayek and Morgenstern. He had far less success with his colleagues at the University of Vienna. Initially he was invited to the sessions of the Nationalökonomische Gesellschaft, but it soon became obvious that a productive debate with members of the Austrian school, Wiese, Mises, Meyer, Weiss, and Strigel, was impossible. This was not primarily a question of different political orientations. Spann's anti-Semitism was notorious. His full professorship in 1919 signaled a somewhat broader anti-Semitic movement that began infecting university life in the early years of the Republic, turning the University of Vienna into a battlefield for Mises and other liberal Jews. Kelsen proved to be one of the last Jews to obtain a full professorship, which he attained in 1918. The problem was that Spann's intuitive approach was diametrically opposed to the analytical approach of the other members. He believed the task of social theory was to grasp the meaning of totalities, whereas the others thought that such undertakings were unscientific. Mises later made clear that this rejection of Spann's approach had nothing to do with a dogmatic insistence on the virtues of methodological individualism. The point was, rather, that it was the very nature of science to deal with parts rather than wholes. The economic theorist had to identify the relevant parts of social reality and study their interrelations. The students who did not share Spann's aesthetic, epistemological, and political orientations, a minority, found a ready alternative in the courses of Friedrich von Mises. In the years after the First World War and up to his death in 1926, he was the unquestioned authority in general economic theory in Vienna. With the winter semester of 1922, Wiese's devout disciple Hans Meyer succeeded his master, while Wiese himself continued to lecture as honorary professor on the sociology of power. Because of Meyer's presence and a successful second edition of Wiese's textbook, Theorie der gesellschaftlichen Wirtschaft, Social Economics, in 1924, the Wieserian paradigm remained dominant in Vienna long after Wiese's death. The book appeared again in the prestigious series Grundriss der Sozialökonomik, Outline of Social Economics. The series was published in 12 volumes from 1914 to 1930. Especially the first volumes, some of which have appeared in 2 editions, pre-war and post-war, and which deal with the history of economic science and with general economic theory, still have lasting value. Especially noteworthy is the first volume, Wirtschaft und Wirtschaftswissenschaft, 1914-1924, which contains the following essays: Karl Bücher, Volkswirtschaftliche Entwicklungsstufen, Josef Schumpeter, Epochen der Dogmen- und Methodengeschichte, Eugen von Philippowitz, Entwicklungsgang der wirtschafts- und sozialpolitischen Systeme und Ideale, die Entwicklung bis zum Kriege, Edward Heimann, Entwicklungsgang der wirtschafts- und sozialpolitischen Systeme und Ideale, die jüngste Entwicklung. Equally remarkable is Volume 3, which contains Friedrich von Mises' Theorie der gesellschaftlichen Wirtschaft, 1914-1924, and Volume 4, which features Max Weber's famous Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft, from 1922. The fact that Hans Meyer, a second-rate scholar by any standard, obtained Wiese's chair speaks volumes about the influence of his predecessor. Mises must have hoped to obtain the position himself. After all, he had already published 3 books, 2 of which were brilliant treatises, whereas Meyer had not a single book to his credit and very few papers. But Meyer had been cunning, positioning himself as the primary Wieserian disciple. Werner Neudeck points out that Meyer was simply higher up in a pecking order that gave much weight to seniority. Meyer had already been a paid professor ordinarius in Prague and Graz, whereas Mises had only an unpaid position extraordinarius in Vienna. It was disheartening that a man like Meyer obtained Wieser's chair. It was not quite as disgraceful as it might seem in retrospect that Mises did not. A more likely candidate was Joseph Schumpeter, who enjoyed great prestige, especially among younger students. He had become a celebrity in the German orbit through his Wesen und Hauptinhalt der theoretischen Nationalökonomie, 1908, and had found international fame with his Theory of Economic Development, 1911. Both works were published before Mises's first book appeared. 2 years younger than Mises, Schumpeter had become Austria's youngest economics professor in 1909 with the active support of bohm-bawerk and Wieser. After the war, he was considered the main representative of pure theory, second only to Wieser. Schumpeter now held a position at the University of Bonn. He was the only major theoretician from Austria ever to obtain a chair at the University of the German Reich. His time in Bonn turned out to be very successful. Under his leadership, the Department of Economics became a major center of economic theory, with great emphasis on mathematical economics, and one of his students, Erich Schneider, became the leading German neoclassical economist after the Second World War. But even Schumpeter was not in the eyes of the profession the number one theorist in interwar Germany. That rank belonged to Gustav Cassel, 1866-1945, from Sweden, a mathematician turned economist. His core mission was to promote Walrasian mathematical economics. His Theoretische Sozialökonomik, social economics, quickly became the most widely used interwar textbook on economic theory, and its success became international through translations into virtually all languages of the civilized world. Cassel was famous for his rejection of value theory and utility theory as a foundation of price theory. Wieser, Schumpeter, and Cassel were verbal Walrasians. Schumpeter and Cassel are self-declared Walrasians. Their books championed the ideas of Walrasian economics without going into mathematical detail. Single-handedly, they not only kept the Walrasian paradigm alive at a critical juncture of its history, but also managed, in what amounted to a revolution, to make it the dominant approach in economic theory within the Reich. Within only a decade, they turned a large number of the younger German economists away from the historical school and converted them to the Lausanne School of Mathematical Economics, and through translations of their major books, this influence radiated far beyond the German-speaking world. The Austrian tradition of Menge had been kept alive through the scattered disciples of bohm-bawerk, most notably through Mises, but these followers lacked the paid university positions that would have enabled them to dedicate themselves full-time to the development of the Austrian paradigm, and to produce students and future professors. At the crucial time when the collapse of the German Reich brought widespread disillusionment with the tenets of the historical school, Wieser's towering status as the only surviving founder of modern German economic theory provided the verbal Walrasians with a position of supreme authority. Their works introduced an entire generation to mathematical economics, and their style of exposition deluded these uninitiated readers into assuming that there were no significant differences between their works and those of the Mengerian theorists. The confusion was compounded by the fact that Wieser was an economist from Austria. Even in the narrower fields of the theory of money, banking and business cycles, and of the theory of socialism, Mises was not the very highest authority. The great authority in monetary theory was again Friedrich von Mises, who had pioneered the Austrian theory of the value of money and would write the entry on money for the standard German language dictionary, Handwörterbuch der Staatswissenschaften. The Handwörterbuch also revealed the pecking order in business cycle theory. Here the lengthy entry came from the pen of Arthur Spiethof, a Schmallerite to the core who opposed all monetary theories of the trade cycle. Wieser's endorsement of banking school principles and of the assignment theory of money was reinforced through the writings of Schumpeter, the other surviving pre-war authority on theoretical economics. Although Mises's views on money and business cycles found ever more advocates in the course of the 1920s, especially among the younger economists, he lacked the power and influence of the top academic economists. In his contribution to the Festschrift that celebrated Wieser's 75th birthday in 1926, Mises picked the subject of the role of money in the realm of economic goods. Here, he attacked the dominant Misesian income theory of money, arguing that money in general, and gold in particular, was an economic good, not mere tokens for other real goods, and that marginal value theory could therefore be applied directly to money rather than merely indirectly through the value of some underlying real goods. The piece was published only 6 years later. Friedrich von Mises had died in 1926, and the editor of the Festschrift, Hans Meyer, then chose to publish a comprehensive overview of contemporary economic science in 4 volumes. Mises' contribution appeared as Die Stellung des Geldes im Kreise der wirtschaftlichen Güter, translated as The Role of Money in the Realm of Economic Goods, Money, Method, and the Market Process, essays by Ludwig von Mises, Richard Ebling, and others. Those who sought to make a career as professional economists were well advised to immerse themselves in the thought of Mises and Schumpeter. This was exactly what the younger economists did. The 4th generation of the Austrian school was introduced to Austrian economics primarily through the works of Mises, and this formative experience shaped their own approach to economic analysis long after the master's death. Today, Hayek is often considered Mises' most famous student. In fact, however, his Misesian intellectual heritage is striking. In 1922-1923, under the direction of Hans Kelsen and Ottmar Spann, Hayek had written his doctoral dissertation in economics on the theory of imputation. The work was based on the Misesian approach to problems of value and price theory, which was incompatible with Mises' socialist calculation argument. The Misesian approach had found its way into Spann's thought. Similarly, the idea of imputation was familiar to legal theorists. Hans Kelsen had pioneered the pure theory of law, which imputed every single norm back to a fundamental norm. When he updated his thesis 3 years later for an article in Konrad's Jahrbücher, he knew the calculation theory, but had not changed his mind on the question of imputation. This is what Hayek wrote on the topic, without mentioning Mises by name. Of course, insofar as one believes that a completely satisfactory solution to the problem of imputation has not yet been found, we cannot exclude the possibility from the very outset that the determinants of the prices of the factors of production are to be found in the exchange economy alone, and therefore that an imputation of value is not applicable, a view held by several younger authors. Nevertheless, if this view were regarded as valid, the result would be that we would have no satisfactory explanation of economic processes based on the subjective theory of value, and it would also follow that these authors too would lack any basis for many of their investigations. Hayek went on to explain and develop Misesian imputation theory, which in his view was still today the fundamental and most detailed treatment of the problem. He explicitly rejected Mises' argument because it contradicted the Misesian assumption that all social phenomena are explicable on the basis of value theory alone. This fact is crucial to understanding the later stages of the debate on economic calculation under socialism. Although Hayek entered the debate ostensibly on Mises' side, there was a profound disagreement between the two allies. Mises rejected socialism because factors of production could only be appraised in a market economy. Hayek did not endorse this argument because it contradicted the fundamental framework of his economic thought. His own opposition to socialism was not yet formulated, but the paper on imputation theory already indicated the future course of his argument. Hayek's main criticism of bohm-bawerk's imputation theory was that he treated the value of future consumers' goods as ultimate givens, where in fact they depended on present choices about the use of factors of production. This argument would remain a staple of Hayekian thought. Only a general equilibrium model could account for these multifarious interdependencies and solve the intricacies of the imputation problem. Hayek concluded his essay mentioning that the Walrasian school of mathematical economics had already successfully tackled problems of a similar nature, but he cautioned against practical problems of applying mathematical imputation theories. Although they could possibly demonstrate by means of a simplified case that the subjective theory of value is in principle applicable, the complexity of the problem may make it impossible in practice to apply imputation to any large economic system. This is exactly the line of argument that Hayek later stressed in his critique of socialism. As a Misesian value theorist, Hayek could not endorse Mises's argument that a rational socialist economy was impossible because there was no such thing as value imputation. What then were the real reasons for the empirically far better performance of market economies? The solution that Hayek eventually presented in the late 1930s and the 1940s was based on an argument prominent with some economists of the 18th and 19th centuries. These writers had argued that prices contain information about market conditions, shortages, surpluses, and that they steer production in a market economy. When trade is perfectly free, the quantity and the need are apparent in all the markets. Then goods put themselves at their true price, and plenty spread equally everywhere. But when one has once taken all freedom from trade, it is no longer possible to judge either if there is really an imbalance between the quantity and the need, or what it is. Hayek embedded this argument within a general theory of knowledge, explaining the role of information in human action and economic theory, and argued that market prices have crucial importance in transmitting information between the market participants. Hence, the factual superiority of market economies over centrally planned economies resulted from their communicative superiority. Market prices were a better means for the transmission of information. The seeds of these later theories were sown in the early 1920s. Hayek's liberalism came from Mises, but the analytical framework of his economic thought was nurtured through the books and classes of Mises. It was no accident that Hayek became the editor of a posthumous collection of Mises' most important papers, and that he published his first book with Hölder Pichler-Temsky, which had published all of Mises' pioneering studies. All of his life, Hayek perceived himself quite consciously as a member of the Misesian branch of the Austrian school. In 1978, a few years after Mises had died, Hayek regretted that this branch had been almost entirely displaced by what he called the Mises school. In today's world, Mises and his disciples are with some justice regarded as representatives of the Austrian school, albeit he represents only one of the branches into which Menger's teachings had split already among his disciples, the close personal friends and relatives Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk and Friedrich von Mises. I admit this only with some hesitation because I expected much to come from Mises' tradition, which his successor Hans Meyer tried to develop. But these expectations have so far not been fulfilled, even though that tradition may yet prove to be more fruitful than it has been hitherto the case. The Austrian school that today is active almost exclusively in the United States is basically a Mises school that goes back to Bohm-Bawerk's approach. By contrast, the man on whom Mises put such great hopes, and who had taken over his chair, has never made good on the promises. The Meyer line ended with his student Wilhelm Weber, who became the first important teacher of Keynesianism in Austria, says Werner Neudeck in Der Einfluss von Ludwig von Mises auf die österreichische akademische Tradition gestern und heute. Neudeck asserts that Mises was the last economist who managed to establish an internationally recognized school in Austria. But a year after Mises's death, Hayek received the Nobel Prize, attracting new interest to his work and giving the Misesian paradigm a second lease on life. The student on whom Mises apparently had the most profound impact in the early 1920s was Fritz Machlup-Wolff, 1902-1983. Of all later star members of the private seminar, he alone had received his doctorate under Mises's direction. Strictly speaking, only Fritz Machlup was originally a disciple of Mises. Machlup came from a family of entrepreneurs. His father was a cardboard manufacturer, and young Fritz helped him in the management of the firm while he studied economics at the University of Vienna. In 1923, he was involved in setting up a factory for the family business in Hungary, even while he was working on a doctoral dissertation under Mises. At the end of the year, the factory was running, and Machlup had his doctorate. He was admitted to the private seminar, and his relationship with Mises became less formal. Like his mentor, Machlup was an enthusiastic skier and fencer, and they probably spent many hours together in the gym and in the mountains. Their common Jewish heritage was certainly an important factor in their unusually cordial rapport. In the 1930s, Mises wrote to Machlup in the tone of true friendship, while in his correspondence with other intellectual associates, Hayek for example, there always remained a hint of formality. Being Jewish was also the most important factor hampering both academic careers. Starting around 1922, German nationalists and Catholic groups led a campaign to reduce the Jewish presence at the universities. The main organizational vehicle in the campaign was the Katholisch-Deutsche Akademikerausschuss. Mises had been appointed adjunct professor under the Ancien Régime. In the New Republic, he made no further advances. Neither did his disciple. Machlup received his doctorate, and that was it. This situation must have created a mutual sympathy between the two men. Bad as it was, it could not prevent the dynamic Machlup from a successful career outside the university system. A few years later, he became a member of the Austrian cardboard cartel and was also appointed secretary of the Verein Österreichischer Volkswirte, Association of Austrian Political Economists. Machlup was a man of great ambition and talents. The drive of the successful entrepreneur never left him even in later years when he moved to the United States and focused entirely on scholarly pursuits. A poem that Kenneth Boulding composed many years later in his honor testified to the fact. Oh, happy is the man who sits beside or at the feet of Fritz, whose thoughts, as charming as profound, travel beyond the speeds of sound, all passing as he speeds them up, Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3, Mach Lup. With what astonishment one sees a supersonic Viennese, whose wit and vigor, it appears, are undiminished by the years. Machlup wrote his doctoral dissertation on the gold bullion standard. He published the work as a book in 1925, for the appendix of which he also translated Ricardo's Proposals for an Economical and Secure Currency, 1816, into German. 6 years later, he published a study on the role of bank credit and the stock market in the business cycle. Both books demonstrated that their author had very well assimilated the Misesian approach to monetary analysis, and both of them were brilliant contributions extending the work of his teacher. Mises praised this second book with words he had never used to describe the work of any other disciple, a masterpiece. Dr. Machlup Wolf is an excellent economist. The second book, Börsenkredit, Industriekredit und Kapitalbildung, is really a masterpiece, said Mises to Kittredge in a letter dated March 31st, 1933. This was a letter of recommendation for the Rockefeller Foundation. Mises concluded, "There is no doubt that Machlup is in all respects the worthiest man for a Rockefeller Fellowship. This is not merely my opinion, who was his teacher for many years, but everybody's. Last year he lectured at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and had a great success." But it was shortly after its publication that the friendship between the two men became strained. Machlup emigrated to the United States and adjusted, perhaps too readily, to his new intellectual environment. The low point was reached in the 1960s when Machlup started agitating against the gold standard. For several years his old teacher refused to speak to him. The efforts of Mrs. Mises eventually produced a rapprochement, but the old friendship was gone. The LSE connection. The problem of war reparations was the number one issue on the international agenda for the first few years after the war, and remained very prominent until the early 1930s. Initially, the same French and British politicians who had led their countries during the war dominated the negotiations. Steeped in wartime rhetoric, their emotional election campaigns had committed them to hardline policies against the vanquished. Under such circumstances, little progress could be made in regard to Austrian finance and the reparations question. As a result, the second Austrian government under Karl Renner lost the election in June 1920, and a new government under Michael Mayer took over without significantly greater success in foreign policy. Things improved slowly after December 1920, when the leadership at the negotiations was shifted to economic experts. But these men too were unable to reach a workable compromise because of public pressure in England and especially in France. No lasting results were achieved at conferences in Brussels, Paris, London, Cannes, Genoa, Paris again, and London again. It is likely that Mises took part in at least some of these conferences. He was after all an executive of the Bureau for Claims Settlements, and his position with the Kammer made him an unofficial spokesman for Austrian business and banking. He was an eloquent expert on financial and monetary matters, and his sober voice carried weight with the money men abroad. In those years, Mises was asked to co-author 2 entries for the new 12th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. This edition was in fact a 2-volume supplement to the 11th edition. It was probably here that Mises first met some of the eminent economists from Western Europe with whom he would cooperate closely in the following years. Charles Rist from Paris, and Theodore Gregory, William Beveridge, later Lord Beveridge, and others from the London School of Economics, LSE. In November 1922, Mises said he had talked to an English professor about a translation of his book Die Gemeinwirtschaft into English. This was probably Gregory, who was the only Englishman among the recipients of a complimentary copy. Documented contacts to William Beveridge date back to the summer of 1924, when Mises had him and Gregory sent complimentary copies of the second edition of his Theorie des Geldes und der Umlaufsmittel. In early November 1924, Mises travelled to London and talked with Robbins about the translation of Gemeinwirtschaft. He then had him sent a complimentary copy of Gemeinwirtschaft, probably as a Christmas gift. By this time his command of English was fairly good, as evidenced by his comments on the translation that Robbins, and later also Schwarz, made of parts of Gemeinwirtschaft. Still in his meetings with Gregory and Robbins, Mises probably spoke German. Gregory was an excellent speaker of the language, and Robbins could follow a conversation in German, even though he was not himself fluent in it. The LSE connection developed slowly and steadily during the 1920s, especially through Mises's impact on the young Lionel Robbins, 1898-1984. Like most young intellectuals of his era, Robbins was a socialist. Nurtured by school readings of Shaw, Wells, and Ruskin, he had become a member of the National Guilds League after World War I, and collaborated in the Labour campaign for the nationalization of the drink trade. But these experiences with the real-world labour movement disillusioned the young idealist. He began to read the classical liberal economists and from 1920 to 1923 studied economics at LSE, a creation of the leaders of the Guild movement, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Because Sidney Webb cherished academic freedom, unlike his wife or their friend George Bernard Shaw, LSE was spared the fate of becoming the academic mouthpiece of the Fabians. During the 1920s, the school counted a number of excellent economists in its ranks, most notably Edwin Kennan, but also Theodore Gregory and later Robbins himself. Gregory had Robbins and his other students read the great contemporary economists in America and on the continent, many of whom he knew personally. Robbins was therefore familiar with the works of Gustav Cassel, Erwin Fischer, and Frank A. Vetter. Later he turned to the Austrians, and he probably read Socialism in the original German soon after its publication in 1922. He later recalled that the book had a decisive impact on him and solidified his departure from his formal socialist ideals. In those days, LSE students had to prove their ability to translate from 2 foreign languages after their first year of study. 2 other teachers at LSE, Hugh Dalton and Graham Wallace, reinforced in Robbins the resonance of the utilitarian perspective on political questions that emanated from Mises's work. Wallace in particular was a great teacher and authority on the writings of Jeremy Bentham and the philosophical radicals. He constantly emphasized rationalism as the correct approach in politics, especially when it came to choosing political means. And like his young peers in Vienna, Robbins deepened his classroom knowledge through daily discussions with a group of highly gifted friends, such as Jacques Gahan, Arnold Plant, and Georg Tugendhat. Tugendhat was probably the same person who took part in Mises's first private seminar in the winter semesters of 1919-1920. In this case, there was a strong early personal connection between the circles in London and Vienna. These men would form the core of British Austrianism in the following years. Mises probably met Robbins for the first time in the fall of 1924. In October of that year, he wrote to Gustav Fischer that he had received a very serious offer for an English translation of the second part of Gemeinwirtschaft from a Mr. Robbins, a tutor of economics in Oxford. Robbins turned out to be Robbins, and he came highly recommended. He had just accepted a temporary position at Oxford University until 1929. He would alternate between positions at Oxford and LSE. During the next few years, he worked on a translation of Gemeinwirtschaft, Socialism, and later initiated a translation of Mises's Theorie des Geldes und der Umlaufsmittel, Theory of Money and Credit. These projects slowed significantly after 1926, when Robbins was charged with various administrative duties at LSE, to the point that he brought in a co-translator. but his interest in Austrian economics, and especially in the work of Mises, grew constantly. At the beginning of the 1930s, the contacts between Vienna and London had matured to such an extent that Mises and his students were frequent guest lecturers at LSE. The blossoming of Austrian economics in Britain culminated when F.R. Hayek eventually became professor of economics at the London School of Economics in the fall of 1931. Advent of the gold